Thank you again so much for joining us at the 2024 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. My name is Grant Anhorn, and I'm a first-year MBA student here at MIT Sloan, and it is my pleasure to introduce this amazing competitive advantage presentation, the modeling of a new reality, how the Blackhawks built a performant ticket demand model after a transformative first-round pick presented by Ticketmaster. Our speaker today is an amazing guy, Paulino Diaz. He's the manager of data science for the Chicago Blackhawks. And with that, I'll welcome him on stage.
Thank you so much, Grant, and thank you, MIT, for putting this together and giving me sort of the space to share some of my work with you. I'm Paulino Diaz, manager of data science at the Chicago Blackhawks. And in the next few minutes, I'll try to walk you through the end-to-end process of developing a predictive demand model for our ticketing inventory and sort of the challenges that we faced as we embarked on this task, given shifts in our business that were sudden and significant. So some of the topics that I'll be covering today. First, I'll sort of frame what the objectives of the model are and what are the requirements of a successful solution, paired with why the business needs such a solution. Then I'll walk you a bit through some of the challenges that we faced as a business, given the shifts that we had, how this sort of defined our data mining approach and the tools that we were going to use and the process that we were going to follow to make this a solution that was fit for purpose, the results that we've seen to date in the current season. I'll have a brief word on the implementation, meaning what is the tech that enable us to actually get value out of the output of the model and deliver the model to the business, and some considerations of things that we want to improve moving forward as we embark on a new iteration of this tool and see into the future of what this could become eventually. So to set the stage, I think it's important to underscore how central the ticketing revenue is to an NHL franchise, and the Blackhawks are no different. Managing the ticketing budget is central to achieving three of our core organizational objectives, which is being a profitable business. At the end of the day, we are a business. We do want to make a profit out of the activities that we engage in. But at the same time, we want to do what's right by our fans, right? And we want to deliver a best-in-class experience for them, and that requires resources and investments from the organization to make this a reality. And the third objective, which is very closely tied to those two, is growing the revenue, managing our assets so that we are maximizing their potential in terms of what they can bring to the business so that we can deliver it back to our fans. And so these objectives set requirements from the analytics team, my team, in which we need to provide the business with accurate and real-time guidance on what our ticketing budget looks like for the season and what we expect to bring in terms of revenue from this inventory. And at a much more granular level, we need to let the business understand what are the components of that overall budget that might be lagging what our goals are, or that might be overperforming our goals, and where there might be an opportunity to go and capture even more out of those assets. And these requirements, in turn, define the solution that we want to put forward, which is a ticket demand model that forecasts the final ticket sales for each event in our schedule based on the current state of sales of that event, meaning the most up-to-date information that we have in an event should guide what we predict that event will eventually perform. And at the same time, we need those individual predictions to ladder up to an overall budget and an overall forecast that keeps the business in tune to the big picture, right? And what do we expect at the end of the day will be the final sort of value that we'll be generating here. And probably it comes as no surprise to anyone in the room that drafting Connor Bedard was a transformational moment for our organization and shifted the business significantly. But what might be a little less intuitive is the fact that we had been experiencing massive shifts in the past 5 years. So as most of you must know, team performance had been declining, which in turn had generated a decline in demand and a reshuffling of our ticket buyer base, right? We were slowly transitioning from a very robust full season buyer base to a much more central role of single game inventory in terms of the overall revenue pie. This was further precipitated by the fact that we were becoming a lot stricter who we allowed to hold plans, right? We had a much more stricter broker policy in place that sort of cleaned our marketplace and tried to avoid sort of these brokerage opportunities. And to sort of counteract these two trends, we reevaluated our suite of products, we increased the flexibility of our plans, and we try to prop them back up against our single game inventory so that they became a viable alternative again for fans. And then the draft lottery announcement happened, right? And I have a few stats here, but I think at the end of the day, what was really clear to us right off the bat was that we had experienced a massive shock to our demand, right? A positive shock to our demand. So any previous forecast that we had literally just had to go in the trash, and we had to start from scratch. And so as we embarked on this journey of building this predictive model, we decided to reevaluate not only what we were going to deliver, but also like the strategy via which we were going to deliver it. Traditionally, we've always followed the industry standard ML process for development of machine learning models, which consists of a business understanding phase, data understanding phase, feature engineering, modeling, and implementation stages. These are not linear stages, right? We iterate over these different steps, and we go back and forth until we find a solution that is suitable to what we need. And what we found in other projects as we go through this cycle is that we tend to focus a lot of time on feature engineering, right? Because we want to control for every pattern under the sun and make the model this omniscient thing that understands everything that we want it to understand. And at the same time, we're drawn towards really fancy model architectures and state-of-the-art algorithms that sort of are sometimes hard to train and very complex to set up, right? So as we looked at what we needed to change this time around, it was very clear that no amount of patterns that we captured were really going to help us, or no amount of feature engineering was really going to help us with this unprecedented situation, right? There were no ways we could control for what was going on in our business. And at the same time, if we were feeding sort of these patterns that were not aligned to one another in terms of the data input that we were giving, any sort of model, even if it was a state-of-the-art model, was going to produce the results that we needed it to produce. And so what does refocusing our attention to sort of business understanding and exploratory data analysis means? It means that we really want to dig deep into what has changed in our data, what has shifted in our business based on all of these challenges that I described anecdotally above. What does that mean for our data generating process and the distribution of the inputs that we're going to feed into the model? On the top left corner, you can see the cumulative sales curve for an average game in a given season, going from the 2011 to the 2023 seasons of our data. On the right-hand side, you see exactly the same data, but represented as a % of total sales. So the cumulative distribution of tickets sold for a given season in the average game. On the bottom, you have exactly the same data again, but now I add the 2024 season. This is the season that we're trying to predict. This is our target. We don't see this when we're modeling all of this behavior, but this is what we're aiming to eventually capture, right? And so just looking at the top two plots, it becomes really clear that one, if you look at a specific days out range and find the value across seasons, there's massive variance, right? You find very different values. So our data input has shifted. The current state of sales means something different at a specific days out range, depending on the season that you fall into. And at the same time, the mapping of these inputs to our response, which is the final state of sales, has also changed, right? Because two seasons that might converge along a given path might have very different final outcomes, and vice versa. So it became absolutely central for us to find the true most meaningful sample that was going to help us generalize the patterns that we were looking for. So if we were to feed all of this into a model, we were probably not going to get the outcome that we wanted, which means that we were shifting from a model-centric approach in which you try to find the best algorithm that performs on all of your data to a data-centric approach in which you find the subsample within your data that really captures the signal that you're looking for. And as you throw it into algorithms, you see an improvement across a variety of them, and not just the one or the most hyper-tuned state-of-the-art neural network, right? And so that's exactly what we did. Actually, one more point here. So not only did we change sort of the amount of data or the subsample of data that we were feeding into our model, but also the way in which we phrased the question for the model. Instead of asking it to predict what is the final state of sales for a given event. We just wanted to know what is the percent of total sales to date, meaning we were changing the dimensions of the questions from one of magnitude and timing to simply predicting what is the time of arrival of demand. We don't care about the magnitude, right? And as we go through this process and as we check these very different modeling approaches, we eventually land in a model that uses as input one observation for each event and days out combination that tries to predict the percent of total tickets sold to date as opposed to the final tickets sold to date, and that uses roughly 30% of all of our available data, which is 4 seasons and only 93 days out range is the max that we ask for the model to train on, essentially. And as we go through this process and as we're trying to find the best model, we can not only look at sort of the aggregate performance metrics or how is the model performing on aggregate across everything. We need to really understand how it's performing against every sample of our inputs so that we know that it's generalizing across a variety of seasons, across a variety of patterns. So on the bottom left plot, you see essentially each color represents a season of data that we feed into the model. The performance does degrade significantly for the 2023 season, which is probably our most relevant season, right? The one that just happened. But it's still at an acceptable range below 4%. So now we're growing confident in that even if it doesn't completely generalize across all seasons, the one that performs the worst is still somewhat acceptable to us. And then we not only care about the sort of the magnitude of the error, we care about the direction of the error because we're aggregating this up into an overall budget, right? So if all the errors are in one direction, well, that means we're gonna blow up our prediction for the aggregate total forecast. So we looked at the residual plots, and what we wanna see there is precisely that, a model that even though it's making errors, those errors are centered around 0, right? The true value, which means as you aggregate them all up, that becomes a much more accurate and unbiased measure of what you're truly expecting to happen. And that's exactly what we saw in the results to date in the current season, which is a model that performs roughly below the 4% average, all the way out to 2 months before an event. But the margin of error does become pretty large after you go past the 2 months. So I think it's important to sort of ask the question, right? Like, are we meeting the objectives that we set out to meet at the beginning of the presentation, which is, 1, provide the business with a real-time sort of understanding of those components of the budget and how they might be lagging or surpassing what we set out as our goals. And the answer is if you have 2 months in advance to look at a game and say, like, is this gonna actually perform within a 4% margin of error in the way that I expect, that's a pretty good sort of outcome for us. And then as we move further out, if you look at the residual plot on the left-hand side, you can actually see that the errors are centered around 0, even in this new season, which means that we can aggregate them all up and we get an unbiased and accurate forecast of what the total budget is gonna be. The errors essentially cancel out. So a quick word on the implementation. So far, most of what I've discussed is that model training portion on the bottom left of this plot. But in reality, there's a lot more that goes into actually delivering value out of a model to the business, right, and to the business users. And I won't go through each of these steps in detail. They're kind of just the steps that I summarized earlier, but in a diagram. What I will call out is we have this feature that essentially allows us to evaluate the model in real time as it's making predictions on the current season of data, and we are delivering that confidence in the predictions to the business in the prediction itself. The output that goes into the dashboard has a confidence interval based on the current season of data that lets the business know, can I be confident or not in this prediction? And so what are we looking for in future versions of this model? First, I think so far our sampling approach has been somewhat inefficient, right? There's new research actually coming out from MIT that allows us to measure the overall fit of an input to the prediction task at the individual level. And what that means is that we can now feed our whole season of data, and as the model is looking to make a prediction, it will automatically subsample our data for the most relevant inputs and make that prediction for us. The other thing that we're looking to build is sort of an ensemble of models, right? Different days out ranges have very different performance. Perhaps it's better if we developed a different model for each days out range and then just combine them along the sales cycle until we get sort of a hyper-relevant model for each of the timeframes that we're looking to predict. We also want to increase the level of detail of the prediction, right? Why stay at the game level when in reality, one of the biggest levers that we have is prices, right? So we're going to try to embed a pricing sort of optimization prediction that's at the price code level based on the demand that we forecast to see for a given section of the arena. And finally, I think there's also an opportunity to embed more real-life monitoring of the model for the business users, perhaps by dashboarding a model evaluation that lets them understand, okay, I can be actually confident in this prediction, or if they can't, to come back to us and say like, hey, this is not delivering what I thought out to deliver, so let's make adjustments. And these are just some thoughts on how we could improve this moving forward, but I hope that this has sparked some ideas amongst yourself, and I would be happy to discuss them with you. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Congrats on what looks like a really interesting, dynamic model building exercise. It's really challenging in my experience doing this sort of model build. I'm interested in how the stakeholders have responded to it, particularly with you showing the confidence information, which is clearly best practice, but sometimes business users are a little bit nervous of that sort of thing.
So far, the response has been no response, which is the response I want. You know, like no one's complained, which means like everyone sees the forecast, and then the expectations that we're setting forth are actually being realized. So everyone's like, okay, yeah, this is what they said would happen, and this happened, and that's generally the feedback that I've gotten so far.
Thank you for the presentation. I just had a question, obviously, in the way that hockey sports drafting works in comparison to other sports. It's a very unique situation with the lottery, and obviously the Connor Bedard situation was very new for hockey. They don't have kind of the flagship people coming in every year. Do you think this sort of oriented model will be used into other stadiums and other teams like in other sports, or do you think it really only works for this sort of style lottery pick, things like that?
I think, honestly, this is the approach that I'm going to try to follow moving forward. I think the situation that we found ourselves in really forced us to reevaluate our data mining process overall and sort of figure out the places where we were not doing what we set out to do, because this, I think, was the standard for us to begin with, right? This is what we were trying to achieve. This is the way we were setting out to build sort of these solutions, and then along the way, we kind of got a little bit careless about where we emphasize sort of our time and resources, and this really sort of forced us to tighten the belt, right, and say like, okay, we need to be optimizing our time and effort in a different way and extracting value from places that we usually don't extract performance from,
Hey, I had a technical question. Can you go back to the model drift slide? Sorry. I'm actually just kind of interested in like what methodology you used to actually measure model drift, or sorry, not model drift, data drift and concept drift, because this is like an area where I feel like there's a lot of ideas about how to do that, but like no one agreed upon like this is the way to do it. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily use a metric here, right? Like it just it was blatantly clear that it existed, right? So I didn't feel the need to really go deep into, okay, this is the exact measure of drift that we had. We had drift, and it was kind of like obvious for us. I think that is a great point in terms of like how we evaluate the model and do the real-time monitoring, right? To say like, can I use this model next season? Well, I need to go and check what has been the drift season to season, and if this is actually something that's gonna hold up to what my expectations are of what's gonna happen next season, right? So I think that's something that I'll definitely have to consider much more closely as I'm trying to reuse this model, right?
Paulino, very impressive modeling here. Great job. Another big picture question for you. When you talk about how you get the business stakeholders to align to using this modeling technique up front, and more in particular, what actual outcomes are you, or to what extent is the model informing things like single game ticket pricing, budgets, and how do you get to marry sort of this technical approach with maybe the more art when you have business stakeholders that are wanting to set budgets, pricing, these kind of things?
Yeah, I think there are some parameters within the model that are assumptions that we discuss with stakeholders as we set them, and those assumptions do define what the actual overall budget looks like, right? So at some point we all sit down and say, okay, these are our assumptions, this is what those assumptions lead to in terms of the overall budget that we want to set forward. Are you comfortable with that budget? Does that resonate with your experience and what sort of you had expected as a budget, right? And in terms of what actions are being driven by the forecast itself, I think right now it's an alert system, right, in which the flag is either, oh, there's a big opportunity here, let's see what we can shift to capitalize on it, or, oh, there's some risk happening here, let's dig into what that is creating that risk, and let's try to optimize that so that we don't fall behind, right? So the next step, like I mentioned, is getting more into that prescriptive part, which is actually going a level deeper into the price code level, predicting the demand of the price code, and then figuring out, okay, these are the places specifically that we need to adjust, right?
Yeah, so I had two questions. First would be, was your model predicting sales for season level only, single game sales, or both? And then the other question was, how are these feeding into your dynamic pricing processes throughout the season?
So it's at the overall season level, right? So each game is all of our inventory. It's not just like single game or plans. It takes into account everything. And we did test out different ways of going about this, right? Like we did test out only predicting, for example, single game, but we have some plans that actually have flexibility throughout the season and that are still being sold throughout the season. So we just needed to see the full picture all the time. So that's how we landed on that. And in terms of how they inform our pricing decisions, like I said, it's like an alert system, right? That tells you, okay, this game has an issue or has a really big opportunity. Now let's go and dig deep into, okay, what is the actual inventory across price codes? Which one is moving, which one is not, which one is moving on the resale market? What are those prices? And that adjustment is kind of like business users just with know-how going into the minutia of the data and making those adjustments.
Thank you, Paulino. Question for you. Now that you have this model, could you foresee a situation where maybe the team is considering signing a big ticket free agent and wants to, kind of, see the market parameters for the contract that they might offer them and see if that fits within their, budgetary constraints?
That would be an amazing application, but it kind of goes counter to sort of the season agnostic nature of the way in which we build this, right? Which is supposed to perform regardless of the shocks in demand that we get. So there is no parameter for or input that we control for that is like drafting someone. The idea is that regardless of what shock to demand you get, there is a concrete mapping from current state of sales and days out to a game that lets us to some way minimize the error that we're gonna get in that prediction, regardless of the context that we're in, right? And that's sort of the error minimization that we're trying to do, and by default, then that doesn't allow us to sort of play around with the sensitivity of the scenarios or of parameters like drafting someone or the like. But not that that wouldn't be amazing. I think that's definitely something we would want to explore.
One last question.
Thank you very much. One question that I had was, what were some of the top variables that came up throughout the process of your analysis?
So I actually used over 25 attributes, mostly just different cuts of our transaction data from our ticket inventory, but also some team performance, opponent performance attributes, depending on the game that we were trying to predict. But the model doesn't really care about any of them, right? It cares about two things. What are the tickets that we've sold to date, and how many days are left in the sales cycle, and that's it. 92% of the regression happens with those two things.
Thank you.
Thank you.